I am delighted to be back here at Turtle Bay in the Surf of the Bar. I gave a talk here a couple of years ago about Eddie. And tonight I wanted to talk to you about the phrase, Eddie would go, which has become kind of a mantra for me in my life, and tell you a little bit about my journey to be here. Because Eddie Aikau couldn't be more different than I am. And I never knew him, and yet he has really become kind of a mentor for me, and in a spiritual sense. Like there were times when I was writing this book, the 4-year odyssey of researching and interviewing and writing this book, which I didn't think I would ever finish, where he really kind of did speak to me. But I want to tell you a little bit about my journey first in coming out here, and get a sense of how many of you know about Eddie Aikau. How many of you know about his story and his life? Okay. All right. And how many people have heard Eddie would go, the saying, or seen the bumper sticker? Well, when I first moved out here, I saw the bumper sticker everywhere. And I'm originally from Charleston, South Carolina, and I naively was asking when I first got here, who is Eddie and where is he going and what's the rush? And people were kind of like, oh yeah, Holly from the mainland, and they humored me. And then through a lucky set of circumstances, I got to know friends and fellow sailors who were with him on the last voyage of his life, who told me the story. And one of them knew I was a writer, and she was working on an article, and she told me about him and said, can you tell me a little bit about, can you help me with this story? And when I started listening to what she had to say, at the very end of it, she told this, probably the most incredible story I'd ever heard. And she said, do you think there's a story there? And I just thought, oh my God, that's the most tremendous story I've ever heard. I really want to be able to share this with people. But at that point, I was just, a Malahini, newly arrived from the mainland. I had dreamed about moving to Hawaii, but I just didn't think it was mine to tell. But through a lucky set of circumstances, I ended up meeting big wave surfers and legends like Peter Cole and Fred Van Dyke, and they introduced me to the family, hit it off with the family, and they told me stories that had never, ever been shared about Eddie and his life. And so I'll share a few of those with you. But I want to give you a little bit of backup, because when I was growing up, I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, and yes, there are waves in Charleston, South Carolina. They're very small, Minahuni waves, but I was hooked. At the age of 14, I was fixated and totally obsessed with surfing. And about that time, I took a course in the 7th grade, and I have to remind you, this is in Charleston, South Carolina, in the Low Country. And it was called Cultures of the Pacific. And it was taught by the principal, and we were like, why are we learning this stuff? We were these obnoxious kids, and it was like, Hawaii and Polynesia are on the other side of the moon, literally, the dark side of the moon. None of us will ever go there. But he had been a soldier in the Pacific Theater during World War II, had fallen in love with Hawaiian culture, and said, you know what, I'm going to teach these little kids about something that's really important to me. And he was the principal. He could do whatever he wanted. So we started learning about King Kamehameha when I was in the 7th grade. And later on, I would find out when I moved to Hawaii and became a teacher that this was probably one of the only courses on Hawaiian and Polynesian culture being taught in the entire country, because he had taught it for 30-something years. And he told us, you can call me Mage Richardson, or you can call me the Big Kahuna. And so I called him the Big Kahuna. And, we'd throw shakas out, and, I had no idea that 20 years later, this would become my world, and this is where I would live. But it just goes to show you the influence that people can have on you unwittingly. And I just spoke to him this morning. He used to tell us that he would retire in Hawaii, and he did. He said he was really born Hawaiian but misplaced, and so he was misplaced in a Yankees body, and came out here, and he speaks Hawaiian. And so this started the combination of passion for surfing, and then this background of learning about Hawaiian culture started my interest. And so when I moved here in 1993, it was in the middle of really the resurgence of the Hawaiian Renaissance. And 1993 was the 100th anniversary of the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani. And I didn't know what I'd landed into, but there was a huge resurgence. There were marches with 10,000 people. And Eddie, I came to realize, really represented the best and the most kind of unique aspect of Polynesian and Hawaiian culture. And so I started learning more about him, and we shared a few things in common. We're worlds apart, but we both grew up next to graveyards. He grew up in a Chinese graveyard. The Aikau family was so poor that when they moved over from Maui, Pops Aikau got a job as a caretaker of a Chinese cemetery. And so they lived in the cemetery and would play hide-and-go-seek in the tombstones. And my dad was a minister and a civil rights leader in the South, and I grew up in a very black and white world. And so I dreamed as a kid, when I was learning about Hawaiian culture, that I really wanted to go to Hawaii someday. And my dad reminds me that I would come home from surfing waves this big, and I'd be acting them out at the dinner table and showing the moves that I did, and they would just be like patting me on the head. And I would say, one day I'm going to move to Hawaii, and I'm going to learn all about the culture. And my dad was like, sure you are, son. So here I am. Life can be wild and very strange. And so when I moved out here and started this process of writing about Eddie, there was the fact that we both grew up next to these graveyards, but there was also the fact that came from a very tight family, where family was everything. For Eddie Aikau, his four brothers and one sister were everything to him, incredibly tight. And he was passionate about Hawaiian culture, but the ways that we were very, very different. And I'm talking about what Eddie kind of meant to me, because this is part of a spiritual journey, and this is what Wanderlust is about in many ways. It's about kind of finding out who you are and what your purpose is, find your true north. And I found it with Eddie. And he kind of spoke to me in many ways, because this was during the 70s in Hawaii, this resurgence of Hawaiian culture had a lot of Hawaiian pride, but there was also a lot of anger that was rising up. But the one place that would never happen was at the Aikau family in this graveyard. They would have the biggest luau's and parties that you can imagine. And if I could go back in time, I would love to go back to one of those parties, because you had the mayor, you had these surf bums, you had professional surfers from all over the world, you had businessmen, and you had the best musicians. And they would drink what was called swipe, which Pops Aikau had invented. So there's a knowing laugh over there. Swipe was a concoction made with fermented pineapple juice. And they used to call it the Howley Slayer, because it tasted so good going down, and these guys would drink it, and Peter Cole, who's 6'7", would say, the first two would be so good, and your mouth would start to tingle, and then your lips would go numb, and then I'd wake up next to a gravestone. He's like, it happened every time. And they would have these parties with the best music, and the family would come together, and they would sing, and they all played music. That was one of the great passions of their life, surfing and music. And people really enjoyed them. So you had people from all over that felt at home there, even in the midst of all this racial tension that was going on. One after another said this was a place where you knew you were safe. The Aikaus looked after everybody, and they cared for people. So I mention that because one of the stories I'm going to tell you happened here at Turtle Bay. And it was called the Kualima Resort there. And Eddie Aikau had become one of the most famous big wave surfers in Hawaii. He went out one day in 1967 during one of the largest swells ever and caught some of the largest waves ever ridden at Waimea Bay and made a name for himself. He was in the papers, he was in the surf magazines that were coming out, and he became just someone that little Hawaiian kids and people on the mainland started idolizing, because this guy was fearless. He would go on any wave. And he also became one of the first lifeguards. And he almost didn't become a lifeguard because there was a requirement that you had to have a high school degree. And Eddie, when he was growing up, was making good grades until about the 7th or 8th grade, which as a teacher, that's when you start to see it happen sometimes. And he just got restless, and he just didn't care about it anymore. And his father would, it was very important, education. He said, what's going on, son? And he's like, well, they just teach us about all this stuff that doesn't have anything to do with my culture. Doesn't have anything to do with Hawaiian history. And he was frustrated. He was not interested. And so he eventually dropped out of school, and his father said, well, if you're not going to go to school, you have to work. So he started working at Dole Cannery and would work all night long, his shifts, the midnight shift, and then go in surfing right after and surf these huge waves. And becomes a lifeguard because they make an exemption for him, because even though he didn't graduate from high school, they realized that this guy had more knowledge and wisdom about the ocean than pretty much anyone. And as a surfer, he had already saved so many lives just on his own, because that's the kind of person he was. He was incredibly passionate, incredibly giving, and would risk his own life to go after and help somebody who was in danger. So he has this reputation, as this major icon already at an early age. He was still in his 20s, and he was coming up as one of the great kind of figures. But doing something like this, standing in front of a group of people and speaking, he would have died. This was one of his great things that people don't know about him. He was painfully shy. He really, even with his own family members, they'd say he wasn't super talkative. He was just a very quiet guy and very introspective. And they knew that he was kind of a deep thinker, but you had to really kind of get a few beers in him to open up and talk. But he started gaining this reputation and was respected not only for his big wave prowess, but he had saved, by the end of his career on the North Shore, he was the first lifeguard at Waimea Bay and one of the first lifeguards on the North Shore. He'd saved hundreds of people, and no one ever died on his watch. That's amazing, because during this time period, literally, you'd have at least 5 people dying every year or so, because they'd just be wiped out. We don't realize, and a friend of mine who's knows a lot about the ocean, he's a photographer, incredibly savvy, and during one big swell at Waimea Bay, he went out on the point just to get some photographs, and he'd watched it for 30 minutes. There were no waves. It was kind of safe in this area, and out of nowhere, this wave came, and he saw it. It was too late to do anything, and he just covered his camera like this, and he said the last thing he saw was the wave breaking over him and just slammed him against the rocks. And Eddie would say these kind of things would happen all the time. Just literally catch people and pull them out to sea. And he would anticipate it. He could see something happening before it did. So he was incredible that way, in that he was always, most of us, you know how it is, we get in our own heads, we're thinking our own thoughts, and we're thinking about so many different things that we lose sight sometimes of what's really important. And this is one of the lessons I've taken from Eddie. He was vigilant, and he knew and he could foresee people around him that, might be in trouble, and he could sense it before it happened. And that's why he was so good, because he would be there right when it happened, or right after it happened, or even before it happened, and warning people. And that comes to bear. He brought his lifeguarding skills, I think, to this incident that happened here, when during the 70s, how many people have heard of Rabbit Bartholomew, the Australian surfer? He was loud and brash and was getting in all the surf magazines. He was the exact opposite of Eddie. And he called himself, he was Rabbit Bartholomew because he used to jump around so much, but he called himself Muhammad Bugs as well, because in Australia you have to have a nickname or 3. And he was taking after Muhammad Ali, and so part of that was talking trash. And they had come to the North Shore, these Australian surfers, Ian Kanga Carnes, and Rabbit Bartholomew, and they had said, basically, we're busting down the door. We're coming here, and we're taking over. We're the new hottest pros, and they did. They got in all the magazines. They started winning all the contests, but they also really, really irritated the Hawaiian people, because this was during the Hawaiian Renaissance, right? And this brash way of speaking, this bravado, was the exact opposite of Hawaiian culture, where ha ha ha, humility is the most important thing you can have. You never talk about yourself. You never talk about how good you are. It's verboten. And so here these guys like bragging about it and writing articles about how great they are and talking trash, which in the Australia is just the way you do things. It's, it's part of the spirit, and it's harmless. But they didn't feel that way. So at one point, and I was talking with Rabbit Bartholomew about this while we're watching the Pipeline Masters, and at that point he'd gone on to become the head of the entire international pro surfing circuit. And he said, I can remember surfing at sunset, and then all of a sudden all the guys went in, and all of a sudden these big Hawaiians started paddling out. And he said, what's going on here? And they came right up to him, and they just started beating him senseless. And he lost a couple of teeth, and they would dunk him in the water, and he'd pass out, and they would wake him up, and he basically swam in and ran down the beach and hid in some bushes, went back to his housemate from South Africa, and he's like, sorry, mate, you got to go. Like, they're going to burn down the house if you're here. And so he was like, this is serious. So he came to the Kualima Resort, he and Kanga Carnes, and they realized suddenly how serious it was. There were death threats at him. They had touched the very last raw nerve of some of these Hawaiian surfers, and they were pissed. And it just got so heavy. And he said, we wanted to just bring the sport of surfing make it something that we could be proud of. This was the infancy of the sport. And he said, all of a sudden, everything was falling down. My whole dream was falling down all around me. And they were literally, one of them would stay awake the whole time, and they had bats and tennis rackets. He said the best thing about it was my tennis game got really good because he wasn't allowed to surf, and he wasn't going to go out and venture out in the water. And he said they would just wait, and if anybody came near, or they saw anybody outside, it was bats and rackets, ready. And one night, they heard a knock on the door, and they looked outside through the peek hole, and they literally got their bats and rackets, and there's Eddie Aikau, and they're looking at each other like, it's Eddie Aikau, like the most intense, respected surfer on the North Shore and in Hawaii. And they're like, what's going on, Eddie? And they're like, he opened the door, and he came in, and he said, that night changed my life. He's like, here was this quiet, painfully shy guy. And he sat down. He's like, this has gotten really heavy, guys. You don't know. You're over your head. And he's like, you don't understand what you've done. And Rabbit said he explained to him Hawaiian history and that how they had lost their kingdom, the overthrow of the queen, how they had lost their land during the Great Mahele, how they had lost a lot of their cultural traditions. And surfing was kind of the last bastion of Hawaiian culture. And he said, and you're taking that away from us. And that's why they're so angry. This is our last thing. This is the thing that our gift to the world. And by the way, it's the gift to the world of skateboarding, snowboarding. The idea of riding a board came from Hawaii on waves. Skateboarding came out of surfing, and snowboarding came out of surfing. And so he said everything just it dawned on him what he had done and why they were so offended. And so, believe it or not, Eddie Aikau set up a tribunal here in one of the conference rooms at the hotel. And he was going to do a ho'oponopono session. Ho'oponopono means to make right. Pono is right, and ho'oponopono is to make right, to resolve issues. No one leaves the room until it's resolved. It's one of the great, great gifts of Hawaiian culture to the world. And lawyers use a various form of it, of ADR, alternative dispute resolution. Like, you sit down and you figure it out. And that's what they did. And Rabbit said he's never been so scared in his life that he's sitting at this table in front of an audience full of angry Hawaiians and other people who've just come to spectate the slaughter. And he said the whole time, Eddie was next to me, and I just kept my eyes on him. Because even when Hawaiians came and rushed the stage and were threatening to beat him up, they knew that as long as Eddie was right there and calming things down, it would be okay. And that's what happened. There was a lot of anger, there was a lot of yelling, and then at the end, they resolved it. And Rabbit said, my life was changed forever at that moment. And so was the sport of surfing, because he knew at that point then need to bring a new dignity to this sport, this fledgling sport that was just coming up. And he committed the rest of his life to doing that. And it really became more of an international sport based on, that he created a lot of the things that he did. So one of the aspects that you've probably heard about is his sailing on the Hokulea. And how many people have seen the Hokulea, just to get a sense of... The Hokulea was the double-hulled Hawaiian canoe that brought the first Polynesians to Hawaii, more than 800,000 years ago. And I don't know if this is ringing. All right. So it was my mother calling to see me how the talk was going, but I assume it's going well. He had, at this point in his life, when he resolved this dispute, his status went through the roof. People saw him in that meeting, and they were like, this guy is a leader. As painfully shy as he is incredible. He had that whole room and the most intense, angry Hawaiians, and they were not going to do anything without him. And he resolved this dispute. And he went on, one of his great dreams, his great hero was Duke Kahanamoku, and the biggest contest of the time was the Duke Kahanamoku Classic. And he went on, he competed in it since 1967 when the Duke was alive, and one of my favorite pictures, I don't know if it flashed on the screen, was him and the Duke, who was his idol. In 1977, after competing for 10 years and watching his brother win the event 4 years before, he finally won the contest that meant the most to him. And he won it, and he said this was for the Hawaiian people, and it was not far away from here, Sunset Beach. And there was one more thing that he wanted to do, and that was to sail on the Hokulea. He had completed his dream of winning the Duke. He was named lifeguard of the year. He had all these honors, but the thing that he missed most was when he was growing up, it was not cool to be Hawaiian. It was something that most Hawaiians were ashamed of. And you didn't use your Hawaiian name. Your Hawaiian name was in the middle of your name, usually your middle name, partly because they forbid it for a while, and they condemned the language. And he had always been, his father was almost a pure Hawaiian, one of the last of the full Hawaiians, and he was like 3/4 Hawaiian. And he always loved his culture, and by the time the Hokulea came around, this vessel represented everything that was great about Hawaiian culture, because it showed the world that Hawaiians and Polynesians had been some of the greatest voyagers ever, that they had sailed from the Marquesas, from Tahiti to Hawaii without compass, without quadrant, without deep-hulled ships, and Europeans and many people in science and anthropology said there's no way they could have done it. They had to accidentally drift here. Yeah, 2,500 miles of drifting to a pinpoint of an island. Eddie and fellow Hawaiians knew from their chants they had learned and the stories they had heard that his ancestors had sailed these sea roads and that they had explored and explored until they found the most isolated island chain in the entire world. And he knew this in his heart. So when the Hokulea had its voyage in 1976, and it sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti in about 30 days, using only the stars and the swells and seabirds as guides. National Geographic did a documentary about it. Reporters from around the world were there to document it. And 18,000 people, more than half the island in Papaete, met this canoe as it came in, and they were so excited they climbed on it and started to sink it. And they had to beg people to get off after they just met this huge journey, and now it was about to sink in the harbor. But it was one of the proudest moments for Hawaiians to see that they were these great explorers. They were some of the greatest navigators. There was a lot of racial tension on that first voyage. So Eddie had backed out at the last minute from the 1976 voyage. They had had an escort boat with them. 2 years later, they were going to sail again because some people, people who were skeptics, academics, were saying, oh, well, the escort boat that was sailing 2 miles behind could have radioed them directions. Well, there was no radio contact except in an emergency. So in 1978, to prove once again, this voyage, they sailed, but this time without an escort boat. And they left on March 17th, 1978, and 10,000 people came to see them off, and the pressure was so strong, and the media was there, and the world was watching, and everybody was thinking, we can't go because the winds are increasing, there's storms on the horizons, the swells in the channels are getting bigger, and they knew they shouldn't do it. But nobody would stand up because it was the public pressure of wanting to leave. And Eddie and all of them had a sick sense that they shouldn't go, but they did. And they left a little before sunset and sailed into one of the roughest roughest channels in the world. And they were slowly taken in water because it was night, and they didn't know. One of the hatches had been left undone, and so water was getting in the hulls. And a rogue wave came because the waves were getting bigger and bigger, and the winds were growing stronger, and it capsized. And here they are. Their emergency beacon is floated off into the night. The emergency radio is drowned. They have no way of contacting anyone, and they're in this incredibly dangerous channel, holding on to this overturned canoe. And all night long, they're holding on. Now, if you can imagine this, Eddie is a lifeguard through and through. No one has ever died on his watch. And two of his crewmates are getting sicker and sicker as they go on. Incredibly seasick, getting hypothermia. They're just holding on. 8-foot swells are breaking over them all the time. They're holding on for dear life. And he asked the captain, let me go. And the captain says, no, we stay with the ship. And Eddie pleaded with him, and he said, no. And then hours later, when things are getting worse and the people they've gone unconscious, Eddie says, let me go. I can make it. The island is only about 12 miles away. I can paddle. I can make it. And the captain is torn because one of the people who's sick and unconscious is his sister. And she was the only female, and she was the one that told me the story. And you can imagine how torn he was. And still he said, no, we've got to wait. We'll wait till morning. Morning comes. It's even worse. They're drifting farther and farther. Now they're 15, 16 miles away, out of the shipping lanes, out of the flight lanes. And finally, Eddie asks again. It's his instinct. He's a waterman. He's a lifeguard. He can do this. And the captain relented. And the whole time, everybody was thinking, if anybody can do this, Eddie can do it. Eddie would go. He would go to save someone at Waimea Bay in the most dangerous conditions. He would go and take off on the biggest waves that no one else would touch, even the best riders in the world. And he would volunteer and sacrifice his life, if necessary, to save his crew members. And on that, So that morning, he paddled off, and he was never seen again. Sorry. I've told this story many times. But every now and then, I don't know what it is, it just hits you about that kind of sacrifice and what kind of man it takes to do that. So he disappeared, and they launched the largest air, land, and sea search mission they'd ever done. People were walking along the coast, along here. People were a friend took out a private plane and had a terrible cold, but he was just flying along the coastlines. People took out their boats. I mean, it was a massive, massive search. And he wasn't found. And in many ways, it was one of the most tragic things to happen in modern Hawaii. But while I was writing this story, one of the things that occurred to me was that, in a way, and why the story was so compelling to me is that it wasn't tragic. Is that, yes, we lost one of Hawaii's great, great icons and a great man, but it was almost as if he had a sense that he was going to be lost. because he had paid all his debts. He had renewed his life insurance policy, and he was 32. He had finalized his divorce to the woman he loved, the great love of his life, who he didn't want to divorce, but something compelled him to make sure everything was taken care of. And by the time he left, the divorce was literally finalized on the day of his life. And he actually confessed to family members. He said, I might not be coming back. And so I think he had a sense that something was going to happen. The Hawaiian singer Israel Kamakaviva Ole said, we Hawaiians, we live on both sides. And we have a sense of things that, are coming. And he was very mystical about that. And Eddie was very mystical as well. But the inspiring thing was that he did make the journey. And Hawaii is greater for it. And his legend lives on through the talks that, people give about him. If you've ever heard Nainoa Thompson talk, he's a very powerful speaker. He was the navigator on board the canoe that night and has dedicated all the Hokulea's missions since, including the worldwide voyage, in Eddie's honor, because it was such a powerful thing for him. And there's the Eddie Aikau Foundation, which has students writing essays about Eddie Aikau and Hawaiian values, and they have this essay contest every year. And I help the family, and we get a big crew of volunteers, and we judge it. And one of my favorite essays, one student said, my favorite heroes are Jesus Christ, Bruce Lee, and Eddie Aikau. And I just thought, Eddie would be pleased to be in such a distinguished triumvirate. It sounds like the Hawaiian Holy Trinity. And so it was really compelling to me. And as I was finishing this book, and there were times where I didn't think I was going to find a publisher, I didn't think it was going to work, and I would go swimming, and invariably, I would see a sea turtle swimming right underneath me. And every time, call me crazy, it just spoke to me that it was like, you will do this, because it's bigger than you, it's bigger than him, it's a story that needs to be told. And if you believe in Hawaiian Aumakua, the spirits, the guardians, then, Clyde believes that Eddie was represented by a turtle. And so there were times where he really, spoke to me. So it is a powerful story, and I think if you want to understand modern Hawaiian culture, you really need to know about his life and kind of what it meant then and what it still means today through the Quicksilver in Memory of Eddie Aikau Big Wave Contest, which is broadcast all over the world, one of the most watched surfing events in the history of, modern sports. And he has a lot to teach all of us in that, you have to remember he was a high school dropout. He was an incredibly poor Hawaiian. He, was kind of embarrassed by his culture when he was young. And he went on to become one of the greatest Hawaiians we have. And so it was a matter, he's taught me about perseverance and commitment and sacrifice. And I think that's, a lot of what we can learn from him and why his, the bumper stickers, when you see it next time, think about what that means. And there are times, when it's from the silliest things, from writing an article to taking off on a wave, I start to hesitate, and that saying comes up, Eddie would go. I'm like, go for it. It's just become like a mantra for me and for so many people I've talked to. I did an article for a running magazine, and they're like, you can't believe how many people use Eddie would go when they're running marathons. I'm like, really? Eddie was not a runner by any means. And yet it's just got this inspiring message that he's brought. So I will close on that. We will open it up for questions if you have some. I'm sorry I went on a little long, but we will also have some books if you want to get some afterwards. But I really appreciate you guys coming out tonight and listening. Thank you. Yes.
Can you tell a little bit how at the first Duke there was no native Hawaiians, but him and Ben Aipa just went ahead and paddled out?
Yeah, in the first Duke contest?
Yeah.
So in the very first Duke contest that they had, they invited, and this is the most prestigious contest in the world at this point, and they didn't invite any Hawaiians the first year. And they were appalled. They were like, how could you do this? This is our hero. And they made such a stink about it that they ended up inviting two Hawaiians, Eddie Aikau and Ben Aipa. And even though he was just a kid at that time, he ended up getting, I can't remember off the top of my head, it was third or fourth place, and getting a trophy. And there's one of my favorite pictures of all time is Duke Kahanamoku, the silver-haired Olympian god, which he was to Hawaiians. He was considered one of the greatest swimmers of all time, and one of the greatest surfers, the father of modern surfing. And he's handing this Duke trophy, and it's the same people that make the Oscars that are out tomorrow night. It's the same trophy maker, and it looks very similar. And he's handing it to Eddie, and Eddie's just looking at him like, this is the greatest moment of my life. I got blessed by Duke. And he wanted to win it when the Duke was still alive, but he had to wait 10 years, but he did finally win it. And it was just such a great moment. People who were there everybody was rooting for Eddie at that point. And they said it was his contest from start to finish. He was like a man possessed. He got every wave. And it was a great moment. And he dedicated it to all the Hawaiian people. So it was a really beautiful moment. So thanks for sharing that. Any other questions? Gunston 500. Yeah. So I told you I came from Charleston, South Carolina. And, I grew up in a very black and white world, literally and figuratively. And they were separated. And it was not a great place for me because my family was the token liberal family in town, and my dad had come from Atlanta and had reached out to Martin Luther King, and we came to this very, very conservative place. One of the most beautiful places in the world, if anybody's ever been there, and it's an amazing place, but it was still incredibly racially divided. And so, learning about Eddie, one of the most poignant stories is when he went to compete in the Gunston 500 in South Africa. And he went over, it was the early 70s, and it's in the height of apartheid. And he has flown literally 30 hours, to get there. And he gets to the hotel with his teammates who are haoles from Hawaii, and they won't let him in the hotel. And he gets kicked out. And can you imagine, traveling all that way, and you're the honored person because he was chosen to go over there, and you're rejected from the hotel where your friends are staying and everyone else is staying. And then they were saying he couldn't compete on the beach because it was a white-only beach. Heartbreaking. So when I was doing research on the story and talking to people in South Africa, I was like, oh my God, how did he deal with this? And he became friends with, some of you know Jody Wilmot, who is from South Africa. Her mom saw what was happening, and she was a big surfer. Her husband was a surfer, and they loved Hawaiian culture. And she said, you come stay with us. We're going to take care of you. And they basically adopted him, and they became lifelong friends. Jody runs the Talk Story series here, and she said, the Aikau family changed their lives. Eddie changed their lives because he was such a gentle person that they wanted to get to know this family better. And so the whole family moved to the graveyard and just built one of the shacks right next to theirs, and they all lived in the graveyard together. The South African family that was originally from Australia. And it was incredible because that's the kind of people they were. They brought people together from all different countries, races, backgrounds. And so in his own way, even though he was deeply wounded by this blatant racism, he overcame it. He instead of being bitter, he made friends with people who would go out and change the surfing world. So it's a great story in that, again, that adversity head on, Eddie would go and do something different. He made, that experience something that was going to turn it into something positive, and it really did. So thanks for sharing that. Any other questions? Not all at once. Okay. Yes? The next book that I'm writing. Okay. All right. I thought he was going to say, can I pick up his tab? He's left. And yours. Okay. So right now I'm working on a book. I came to the Wanderlust Festival last year, and I was really inspired by it because yoga kind of changed my life. I had some health problems, and I started doing yoga, and it really was kind of transformative for me. And I started thinking about ways that I'm in the environmental movement. I work for the Surfrider Foundation, and we're a nonprofit, and we take care of the coastal areas, beach cleanups, and we do water quality, beach access, responsible coastal development. And we work with Kahi and the boys who at Sustainable Coastline who are awesome. And I've been in this environmental movement. I left my job as a teacher for 15 years because I just thought it was so important that, there are issues that are critical before us right now that we need to change. But I've always been, before, more concerned about social issues. My dad was a civil rights leader, and that was something that I was kind of more concerned about. And what I realized is that there are all these groups and forces that are operating apart from each other. And what we really need are kind of festivals and events like this that bring people together, that make people realize that environmental issues are totally tied to social issues. You can't separate them. And they're totally tied to indigenous culture. We have so much to learn from Native Hawaiian and Native American, Native Alaskan cultures, because what they do is they came from a time where people lived in harmony with the land, and we've lost that. We can see it all over. We have a culture that's about me first, and it's about materialism, and it's about what can you do for me, and that's what drives everything. So this book is about a convergence of different people and different forces, and it refers to the fourth wave of the environmental movement that brings together these social groups, indigenous groups, spiritual groups, yogis, writers, artists, and says we need to evolve to a higher consciousness. That this is the fourth age. We had the primal age, where it was hunter-gatherers. We had the agricultural age and the rise of cities. And then we had the industrial age. And we're coming out of the end of the industrial age. And we're kind of in this new technological age. But it's beyond technological. We have to advance. We can't do things the way we did before. And it's about thinking in new ways and trying to get out of this industrial model where we're only valued for what we can contribute financially. So that's a long-winded answer to what my next book is about. But it's really, it's not as heady and theoretical as that. It's about people who are doing outrageous things that I happen to meet. And I'll just tell you one experience that was amazing. Has anybody heard of the guys who sailed the junk raft across the Pacific Ocean from Los Angeles to Hawaii? They were trying to Surfrider's big into marine plastic pollution. And these guys, two crazy guys, built a raft. I call it a Franken raft. It was just parts from everything. And it was made of 15,000 plastic bottles and the body of a Cessna airplane for the cabin. And they sailed and almost sank, but they made it from California to here. And I literally went online because I had heard about them. I'm like, who are these guys? They're crazy, but I love them. And that day I went online, they were running out of food. And there was a woman, has anybody heard of Roz Savage, who rowed across the entire Pacific Ocean from San Francisco to Hawaii? They had talked on the phone once and were going to try to get together, but they didn't. Well, her water maker broke. Her backup water maker broke. Well, you're done at that point. She's 3/4 away across the Pacific Ocean, and she's going to have to call the Coast Guard to helicopter out and leave this $25,000 boat because her water maker's broken. So she's blogging about this because she has a satellite phone. And, the guys on the junk raft, their mother reads it and says, you need to help that woman. It's like, Mom, we're barely making it. We're going 1 to 2 knots, and this is not the Hokulea. We're barely going to make it. And they're like, you need to go help her. Well, somehow they got in touch with each other. They were able to arrange coordinates, and she said it was like 2 snail slugs coming together over time. She had extra food. They had a backup water maker. They met, and the guys literally said, I kid you not, they were like, we were expecting this big, hairy woman. She's been rowing across, the whole Pacific Ocean. She's got to be big and kind of, And this petite British woman with blonde pigtails rose up, and they're like, oh, my God, we need to take a bath. And so they immediately dive in the ocean, and are washing off. And one of the guys goes and spears a mahi-mahi and is, cooking dinner for her. And so they have this thing, and then literally at the end of the evening, she rose off into the sunset, and they're watching her going, that was surreal. But they decided to work together, and I logged on that day and read that story and was like, this is the greatest story I've ever heard. So that became the beginning of this new book. I set up a press conference with them. We became best friends, and so they're part of this fourth wave movement that we're trying to create. So thank you for listening to that story. We have time for, one more question, if anybody wants to ask. It's called the fourth wave. Yeah, the fourth wave. Yeah, and if you go to my website, stuart-coleman.com, you can learn a little bit more about some of the articles and some of the people featured in it. Yeah. Other question? One more, yeah. Makaha is a place on the farthest, it's the smallest and farthest town on the west coast of Oahu. And it's the teeniest little town you've ever seen, and yet it has produced some of the biggest icons in Hawaiian culture, including Israel Kamakavivole, Brother Is. Everybody know Brother Is? Somewhere over the rainbow. Rel's son, and some of the greatest watermen in the history of the sport. The Kealana family, Brian Kealana invented jet ski rescues. Eddie would have been very proud of him. Eddie was his hero, and that's revolutionized lifeguarding around the world. Now it's used everywhere. And so, fascinating group of people, and I decided after writing Eddie Would Go that I had to write about this other group of people on the west side, just because no one had ever written about them before, and they were so fascinating. But thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it.